Welcome to the OnTarget HTML5 website YouTube channel. The website is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll soon be adding a section on JavaScript, so I hope you visit us at www.ontargethtml5.com. Welcome to the Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial, we are going to start working with functions in ActionScript 3. This is part one. This will be a three-part series on functions in ActionScript 3 because there's so much that we can do with them. I want to really cover a lot of different aspects of how we use functions in ActionScript. So in this group of tutorials, we're going to begin our discussion on functions. Building on what we've learned with the tutorial on variables, functions are the next logical step in our mission to fully understand ActionScript 3. Functions are reusable blocks of code that can be defined in your own classes and are frequently used throughout ActionScript 3 and most programming languages. In programming, functions are the workhorse of our code. They are an indispensable part of any programming language. Functions allow us to wrap our code into blocks, enclosed in curly braces, and only execute that code when the function's called. Functions allow us to organize our code into independent pieces of functionality, thus the name functions. They can be used to return various results based on input that we provide. At its most basic level, a function is a piece of code that has been stored as a saved routine that can be run at will by writing out the function's name or calling the function. We'll have many opportunities to practice writing our own functions as we progress through these tutorials. Functions allow blocks of code to be reused as many times as necessary as we work through the execution of our code. Functions allow us to easily edit our code in a more organized format, which makes the maintenance of our code much more efficient. If functions did not exist, all of our code would execute in a linear manner from beginning to end. Many lines would need to be repeated, and editing and maintenance of our application would be very difficult, if not impossible. If you have any questions on something that I discussed during the tutorial, or any of the tutorials, feel free to contact me through the website. So let's look at the basic syntax of a function. So the function keywords required in ActionScript 3. In ActionScript 3, a function is the basic unit of code that can be invoked inside ActionScript. Both user-defined and built-in functions in ActionScript 3 are represented by function objects, which are instances of the function class. And I want to point out that I've got this sample function on the screen. I've added spaces for clarity. A lot of the spaces that you see on this particular function display are not required, and you'll see that when we get into our demonstrations. Next, we have the name that we give our function. As discussed in an earlier tutorial, follow proper naming conventions. This can be any name that you choose. So now I've got my function keyword and I've assigned it a name. In this particular instance, I just dis message, which is display message. Then we have our parentheses. Parentheses are known as the call operator in the function. Inside the parentheses, you can pass parameters to the function. Parameters are not required, but can add much more functionality to the function itself. We'll demonstrate this many times throughout the tutorial series. Inside the curly braces is the code block. This code will execute each time the function is called or run. This code can include most anything that's valid code in ActionScript 3. We'll go through many examples of different code blocks while working through the tutorials. This is where we actually call the function to be executed. We use the name we gave the function and include the parentheses. In the event we're passing parameters or arguments to the function, they'd be included in the parentheses, as you'll see in the next tutorial. At a minimum, functions must contain the function keyword, the function name, parentheses, the function body or code. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into our development environment and work through the exercises. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's get into our development environment. I'm going to go ahead and open up Flash, and you should be pretty familiar with our screen now. I do want to go ahead and save this file. So I'm opening up the start file that gives us our branding, and then I've saved this as flash_1004_1. If you have a copy of the exercise folders, you'll have copies of all this. So let's start reviewing what we're talking about with functions inside ActionScript. So functions that are built into ActionScript or Flash are called methods. Every program you write will rely heavily upon functions and how we use them. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and add a layer to our timeline. Just going to go ahead and right-click that branding layer, and I'm going to insert a layer, and I want to call this layer Actions. I'm going to go ahead and hit my Enter key, and let's go ahead and lock that Actions layer because I always lock my Actions layer. So I'm going to select frame 1 of the Actions layer, and now I want to go ahead and open up our Actions panel, and again, that's F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Mac. And that's just going to give us our Actions panel right along this edge here, because we'll be working mostly with the Actions panel and the Output panel for this particular exercise. So let's go ahead and type our stop, as we always do, and end that with a semicolon. I'm going to come down a couple of lines, and let's go ahead and demonstrate the function that we actually used in our presentation. So I'm going to type function and dis message, MSG. So that's going to be my function name, my opening and closing parentheses, my opening curly brace, and you'll notice that ActionScript gave us our closing curly brace when we hit our Enter key. And then I want to trace something to our output panel, so I'm going to say trace. I'm going to have my opening parentheses and inside quotation marks. This is my message. I'm going to close the quotation marks. I'm going to close the parentheses. I'm going to end that statement with a semicolon because, again, that's always required. I'm going to come down right below my closing curly brace, and I'm going to go ahead and call that function. So I'm going to say dis msg. Remember, that's the name that we gave the function. My opening and closing curly brace or parentheses, and then my semicolon. So let's go ahead and save this. Let's do a save as, and I'm going to save this as flash_1004_2. This is our second example inside of our exercise files. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and test this movie. And again, that's Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac. So let's go ahead and test it. And inside my output panel, let's go ahead and close the movie itself. I'm going to move the output panel over here. So this is where it's going to come up now for the rest of the demonstration. You'll notice that we're displaying this is my message inside the output panel. So we've actually executed that function by calling it with this display message. If I were to take this out and save that change and then test my movie again, Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac, you'll notice we get nothing in our output panel. The function's still running, but since we didn't call it, we're not seeing anything displayed. So we always have to call these functions in order for them to execute the code. And that's why functions can become so powerful, because we can actually have multiple functions throughout a program, and the only time it actually executes that code is when it's called. So we could be jumping all over the different linear aspect of the program itself and going back to certain aspects or certain portions of that program and calling functions that we need for this particular demonstration. So let's go ahead and save the change so I have that display message back inside my function. Because I want to do now is I want to go ahead and note or make a couple of changes to this particular function. So again, make certain you're in frame 1 of your actions layer. Let me go ahead and bring this down just a tad so that you can actually see that we're in frame 1, because that's where we want to enter all this code at. So we always make sure we're in frame 1 of that actions layer. And what I want to do now is I want to make a couple of changes. So I'm going to go ahead and rem this out so that we don't execute this code this time, but we're going to write a new function, and we're going to call this function display multi. So I'm going to type my function keyword, dismulti, and again, you'll notice I'm using camel case when I name my function names, opening and closing parentheses, opening curly brace. I'm going to type in a trace statement. Again, I open my parentheses and inside quotation marks. This is line 1 of my text. I'm going to end that with a period, end that with a quotation mark, close the parentheses, and end it with a semicolon. Then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this entire line, Control-C in the PC, Command-C in the Mac. I'm going to copy that entire line and come right down below it and paste that line again, and this time just change it to line 2. And all I'm going to demonstrate here is the fact that we can have multiple lines of code inside these curly braces because it will execute anything that we needed to execute for our demonstrations or for our program. So let's call that function dismulti. opening and closing parentheses because we're not passing any arguments, end that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this as _3 in our work files. And now I want to go ahead and test this code. So again, we're going to do Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac to test this movie. And you'll notice now in our output panel, we have both those lines of code. So we can have as much code as we need to have for the particular function inside those curly braces. These become extremely powerful as we're programming. And as you're going to see as we move through these demonstrations and exercises, we use functions a lot inside of ActionScript. All right, so let's look at a real example of how we can really do this inside of ActionScript. I'm going to go ahead and remark this out like we've been doing, because again, I want you to have the availability to all the code that we used. And I'm going to add another layer to our timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and close out my movie panel. I'm going to go ahead and close out my output panel. Let's slide this thing over here so it's a little bit out of our way. I want to add another layer to our timeline right above the branding layer. And I'm just going to name this layer Symbols. And again, if you have access to the exercise files, I actually have a symbol inside my library, this rocket symbol that I created that I'm actually going to put on our stage. If you don't have access to the exercise files, just go ahead and create any symbol you want. Just pull a graphic inside your Flash development environment, pull it onto your stage, convert it to a movie clip using that F8 shortcut key that we talked about in an earlier tutorial, and then just put your graphic on the stage for these demonstrations. I'm going to go ahead and drag this rocket symbol out onto my stage and close that library. Because what I want to do now is I want to use a true example of how we actually use this stuff in ActionScript. I'm going to go ahead and save that change. So I've got that symbol now and it's on my symbols layer inside of my timeline. I want to go ahead and name this movie clip. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. Let's open up our properties panel and I want to give this movie clip an instance name called Rocket _MC. And again, we went through all of this in earlier tutorials on how we do this, but again, in order to access this inside of ActionScript, he's got to have an instance name. I'm going to go ahead and save that change. And what I want to do is let's go ahead and test this in our layer. So I'm going to do a Control Enter in the PC, Command Return to the Mac, and it should do nothing. You notice we just have our rocket sitting there in the middle of the stage. It's not doing anything, it's not moving, there's no animation, none of that. So let's go ahead and close that movie. Now I want to open up our Actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Mac. Select frame 1 of that Actions layer, and then let's come down below the last demonstration that we did, and I want to put in another function. I'm going to call this function. So I'm using my function keyword. Let me go ahead and scroll down so it's easier for you to see this, and I want to call it Man Rocket. So I'm giving the function a name of Man Rocket, opening parentheses, closing parentheses, opening curly brace, and then come down, and ActionScript will automatically close out that curly brace for us. Now I want to use the name that we gave the rocket. Remember, rocket _MC is the instance name we gave it. And I'm going to say rotation. That's a built-in function in Flash, 45 degrees. I'm going to come down and say rocket MC. And then I want to add X. So in other words, we're manipulating the X coordinate of the rocket. That's going to be equal to 200. Rocket _MC dot Y. That's going to be equal to 100. Then I want rocket _MC dot alpha. And we actually looked at alpha in an earlier tutorial. That's going to be equal to 0.5, and I'm going to end all those statements with a semicolon. Now would be a great time to pause if you need to go ahead and catch up with where we're at. Now what I want to do is I want to come down below that function, and again, in order to implement this code, we actually have to call the function. So I'm going to say Man Rocket. And remember, Man Rocket is the name that we actually gave this particular function right there. So I'm going to say Man Rocket, open and close parentheses, and end that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and do a save as on this. I'm going to save this as _4. Save that change. Now to test this movie, we're going to do Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac. And keep in mind what our rocket looks like. Let me go ahead and minimize this panel right now. We've saved our changes. So we've got a straight rocket in the center of our stage. When I do that test movie, you'll notice now it's moved to the X and Y coordinates. It's performed the 45-degree rotation that we talked about, and it's about 50% transparent. So that function, by calling that function, we performed all those features of the code that we ask when we perform the function. We actually did something now on our stage with a function. Instead of just looking at the output panel, we're actually looking at the stage itself, and we've manipulated that movie clip by just calling that function. Let's go ahead and close that movie. All right, so let's continue on building our knowledge of functions inside ActionScript 3. First thing I want you to notice, I have a couple of more symbols inside my library panel. I've got an MC Jupiter and an MC Earth that I've moved in there. I actually just got these graphics from the internet. I've converted them to movie clips, as we talked about in an earlier tutorial. And now they're residing in my library, so I'm going to go ahead and pull a couple instances of those onto my stage. I want to make sure my symbol layer is selected. Let's go ahead and grab MC Earth, and I'm just going to drag that onto that symbol layer. MC Jupiter, I'm going to drag that onto the symbol layer. I'm going to go ahead and close that library panel. If you have access to the exercise files, you'll have these inside your exercise files. If not, you can use any symbols that you want to use for the demonstration. Just remember what you've named them. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to give these instance names, because remember, if we're going to access these movie clips inside of ActionScript, they've got to have an instance name. So I'm going to go ahead and select that Earth symbol, open up the Properties panel, and give it an instance name of Earth_MC, following the conventions I normally follow. Go ahead and hit the Enter key. I'm going to go ahead and select the Jupiter symbol and give that an instance name of Jupiter_MC. So he too will have an instance name. So now all three of our symbols on our stage have instance names. We have Jupiter_MC. I have that Rocket_MC that we used before. And I have my Earth_MC. So all three have the instance names that we need to refer to them inside of ActionScript. I'm going to go ahead and close that Properties panel. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to show you how we can control multiple objects using a function inside of ActionScript. So I'm going to go ahead and select Frame 1 of my Actions layer. I'm going to open up the Actions panel, F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Macintosh. That's going to bring up our Actions panel. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the bottom. I'm going to do a Save As right here. Let's go ahead and do a Save As. I'm going to save this as 1004_5. If you have access to the exercise files, you'll actually have this in the exercise folder. If not, you can just follow along. So I want to create a function, and this one is called MAN Objects. So it's basically manipulate objects, open and close parentheses, and then opening and closing curly braces. Let me go ahead and scroll down a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do is let's manipulate Earth. So it's going to be Earth_MC.alpha, and I want that to be equal to 0.25. So 25% based on what we know about the alpha property inside ActionScript. So 25% transparency. Jupiter_MC. And I want to manipulate the alpha on that also. And that is going to be equal to 0.15, so 15%. Then I want to manipulate the Rocket_MC. And I want to manipulate his rotation. Remember, we're rotating on that point that we set when we made him a movie clip, and that's going to be equal to 180, so 180 degrees. I want to go Rocket_MC once again. And we want to manipulate his y-axis, so we're going to put him at 150, and Rocket_MC. And this time we're going to manipulate his alpha, and that is going to be equal to 0.75%, so 75%. So now we've got different properties inside of our function referring to three different movie clips on our stage. Now would be a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and catch up. Right below our closing curly brace, let's go ahead and call that function MAN Objects. Opening and closing parentheses, and end that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save all those changes inside of our Flash file. Now what I want to do is let's go ahead and test this movie, Control Enter in Windows or Command Return on the Macintosh, and we should see all three of our objects now manipulated by a single function. So I'm going to go ahead and test the movie. And you'll notice now we've got our Earth at 25% transparency. We've rotated the rocket 180 degrees. We've changed his Y position based on our original position on the stage. And we've also decreased his alpha, or increased his transparency. And we've also changed the transparency of the Jupiter_MC. And the point I want you to get from this demonstration is that a function is not limited to manipulating one object on your stage. We can manipulate anything that has an instance name on the stage by using functions. So it's a very important aspect, and you're going to see as we work through the rest of the tutorials, we're going to do many things that are going to manipulate many different objects on our stage using functions and using instance names. All right, let's look at another example that may be a little bit more practical. I mean, we've done some very basic stuff with functions inside ActionScript. Let's go ahead and remark this out so it does not execute with our next demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's save this as _1004_6 inside of our Flash work files folder. I'm going to go ahead and close this movie clip. What I want to do now, I want to look at something that's a little bit more practical to a developer. So let's set up two functions using the items that we have on the stage that may be a little more realistic as to something we might do in a real application. So I'm going to make sure I'm selected frame 1 in my actions layer. I'm going to come down below my last example. And I want to create a function, and this function is going to be called clear objects. And again, notice I'm using camel case as I name these things. I've got my parentheses, my opening and closing curly braces, and I want to say earth_MC.visible. And I want that to be equal to false. And end that with a semicolon. And I want to do the same thing with Jupiter. So Jupiter_MC.visible, and I want that to be equal to false. And then rocket_MC.visible, and I want that to be equal to false also. So now I've created a function that's basically going to clear the objects from my stage, as you're going to see in a moment. Let's go ahead and create another function right below that, and I'm going to call this function display objects. So again, I'm going to use my function keyword, display objects, using my camel case naming conventions, opening and closing parentheses, opening and closing curly braces, and I'm just going to grab this code in this top function. I'm going to copy it, Control-C in Windows, or the PC, Command-C in the Mac. I'm going to come down to my display objects, and I'm going to paste that in place, or paste it, Control-V in Windows, Command-V in the Mac. And all I want to do here is I want to change the property itself, the value of the property, to true. So I'm going to go through and change all three of those falses to true. Let me go ahead and scroll up. Now would be a great time to pause if you need to go ahead and copy this into your exercise. All right, let's go ahead and do a save. I think we've got this saved as 6. Let me go move this for a second. Yeah, I do. I've got this saved as 6. So let's go ahead and do a save to save those changes. And let's call that first function. So I'm going to call my clear objects function. Again, same function name that I used for the function itself, opening and closing parentheses, and end it with a semicolon. So if our functioning is working correctly, when I test this movie, all the objects should clear from our stage. So let's go ahead and save those changes. Let's test our movie with Control-Enter in Windows or Command-Return in the Mac. And you'll notice now we have nothing on our stage. Based on the function that we've called, we've actually cleared all the objects from our stage. And it's not unusual to do stuff like this inside of an application. That's why I said this is a little more realistic to something we may do. We may actually have all our objects cleared on the stage, and certain interaction may actually call them up or change that visible property from a false to a true. So again, I can do the same thing by let's just calling the display objects. Save that change. And now all of our objects, Control-Enter in Windows, Command-Return in the Mac when we test the movie, now they're all appearing. So we can actually, again, manipulate the objects on our stage by using ActionScript. And this is something we could do in a real tutorial or in a real application inside of ActionScript. We've got a lot more stuff to cover in functions, You're just now scratching the surface of what they can do, but you've got a basic understanding now of how they're written inside of ActionScript and some of the things that we can manipulate using ActionScript instance names and symbols on our stage. All right, so let's drop out of our development environment and go over a fast review of what we've covered in this tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and minimize Flash. Let's go ahead and bring back up our presentation. And let's review what we have covered in this particular tutorial. So we talked about the function keyword and the necessity of it being there in order to call a function inside of ActionScript 3. We used our trace statement to trace things to the output panel so we could actually see some of the functions of the function itself, how it was actually operating inside the code. We talked about how we name functions and how I like to use camel case to make the names easier to read because we don't want to use spaces. We're going to follow the same naming conventions that we talked about in an earlier tutorial, both in the beginning of the tutorial series and as we talked about variables. We use the F9 key to open up our Actions panel in Windows and the Option F9 in the Mac. We talked about using Control-Enter to test our movies in Windows and Command-Return in the Macintosh. And we manipulated symbols on our stage using functions inside of ActionScript. We also looked at controlling multiple objects on our stage in a single function. We looked at symbols properties. We talked about the visible property inside of ActionScript, the alpha property, the rotation property, the Y property, the X property, and we went through and actually broke down how a function is written inside ActionScript and what each portion of that function means to the programming code. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I look forward to seeing you in part 2, where we're going to start looking at returning values with the function. We're actually going to look at those arguments we talked about at the very beginning of the tutorial, how we can actually pass those arguments in and get those to manipulate the arguments and pass us out a return. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available in the development environment. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting.